Hi. Oh, good. Hi, everyone. I was going to start with military precision, but good morning and welcome. My name is Bei Fang. I'm president of Radio Free Asia. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion on China's place in the U.S. national security strategy. I'm looking forward to a really nice discussion here. So before we start, let me review a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, please write them as legibly as possible on the index card on your chair and hand them to one of the staff members coming by. If you need an index card, please signal to one of the staff members. I'll pose as many audience questions as I can over the course of the discussion. As a reminder to our speakers, our discussion is unclassified, on the record for any press who are in attendance, and is being recorded. Finally, an important point about health and safety. Masks are required by Prince George's County regulation as well as by the conference venue, so please keep your masks on at all times. If you need to take a drink of water or a bite of your snack, please put your masks back on right away. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. So let me briefly introduce our panelists, adding that their full bios are available on the Summit website and app. To my left is Dr. Michael Chase, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China at OSD, previously a senior political scientist at RAND. To the left of him is Mr. Wayne Ullman. He's the Defense Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the DIA, who spent years as a China military analyst. Left of him is Ms. Lara Crouch, a professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, covering the Indo-Pacific region. And lastly, Mr. Robert Daly, director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S., a fluent Mandarin speaker who, and having a 2- and 4-year-old, I like this part of his CV best, helped produce Chinese versions of Sesame Street. So Michael, I wanted to start with you. Since this panel is about China's role in Biden's national security strategy, can you start by framing the discussion a bit? How would you characterize the Biden administration's view of China? How does it differ from the previous administrations?
Sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for organizing the panel, and thanks to INSA for inviting me and hosting the event. Of course, we take our guidance and DoD from the White House, like all other departments and agencies do. And so I would suggest we look to the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance for a description that explains how the Biden-Harris administration views the challenges presented by the PRC. And I'll quote from that here. It says the PRC is the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. Right? So we're looking at here is something unique, that China is really the only country out there that is able to have the political and diplomatic, the economic, the scientific and technological, the military, and the kind of information and influence capabilities to really challenge the system that we all rely on, and to challenge U.S. interests and those of our allies and partners in that kind of global, holistic way. And so for DoD. That's why Secretary Austin has talked about the PRC as the pacing challenge for the department. And he's urged us to make sure that we're oriented, that we're preparing for the challenges that China presents in all of these areas. And so, of course, some of this is really, principally in the lanes of non-DoD departments and agencies. They have a major role also, of course, in effectively addressing the complex challenges that the PRC presents. But for us, we have in DoD an important role here as well. And the kinds of challenges that we're looking at, they take a variety of different forms. Excessive maritime claims, coercive behavior in the maritime disputes in the South and the East China Seas, influence operations and disinformation campaigns that are more worldwide in scope, the more aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's known sometimes, that many of you are probably familiar with. And attempts to undermine aspects of a rules-based and open international order that has enabled decades of stability and development and peace and prosperity for countries around the world, including China. So that's kind of the sort of nature of the challenge that we're looking at. To meet that challenge, we're committed to defending a free and open and rules-based international order, and to working with our allies and partners to do that successfully. And so when we think about what being engaged in a more competitive relationship with China entails over the longer term, of course, from a DoD perspective, some of that is about force modernization and readiness, ensuring the joint force has the right capabilities and the technological advantages that we need. But a big part of it also in the Biden-Harris administration is that we're really committed to strengthening our alliances and partnerships so that we can work together to address these shared concerns. I think we see that as a really critical part of our strategy to address the challenges the PRC presents. And I think from the PRC's own perspective, their scholars and analysts often talk about the advantages that the U.S. enjoys because of its unparalleled network of alliances and partnerships. So I think we recognize that as a central advantage that we have to work on continuing to build those relationships. And our counterparts in the PRC, I think, also recognize the edge that the alliances and partnerships that we uniquely have present to us. So, when we think about where this leaves us overall, we have a really complex relationship with China that's, I think, consistent with how previous administrations have seen it. Where we're kind of coming at this is that we'll compete with China where we should, whether that's militarily, in terms of scientific and technological developments, economically, and so on. We'll cooperate where there's an alignment of our interests, and it's to our advantage to cooperate, and they're willing to do so as well. So climate change, non-proliferation, potentially could be some other areas of cooperation. Obviously, climate change stands out as a big one. And in those areas where the PRC does things that undermine U.S. interests and undermine our allies and partners' interests, we'll challenge them in a more direct way when we need to. But none of that means that that competition or challenging them in those areas has to kind of lead inexorably to confrontation or conflict. And so we're doing our part in DoD to make sure that we can try to have a constructive, a stable, results-oriented defense relationship with the PLA. We want to be on a path here of transparency and non-aggression, even in the context of a more competitive relationship. And the administration is pursuing that broadly. So just a couple examples at my level. As some of you may have read, I recently held a call with my counterpart in the PLA's Office of International Military Cooperation. We had an exchange of views on the relationship and talked about where we want to go in terms of future exchanges. And President Biden just recently held a call with Xi Jinping, where one of the things that they talked about was how to kind of responsibly manage the competition between the U.S. and China so it doesn't veer off in the direction of conflict. So that's just what I'd like to open up with on that general topic, and I'm looking forward to your questions and a good discussion today.
Thanks so much, Michael. Wayne, let me turn to you. You've spent much of your career looking at China from the intel perspective, and I understand just got back from a conference with other intel chiefs in the region. What's your view on how the China threat is evolving, and is there a shared consensus?
Yeah, thanks, Bay. Wayne Ullman, so I've been working China since the early 90s. At that time, as Paul Godwin used to call it, the PLA had the junkyard army. Many thousands, the Air Force, for example, many thousands of MiG-19, MiG-21 class aircraft, nothing more modern than that. And that was kind of indicative of the entire PLA at the time. Really, that started to change a little bit later. Well, let me give you just a second background on myself. So started out National Air and Space Intelligence Center, kind of one of the gems of the intel community at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. From there, went out to Indo-PACOM, was out there for a number of years, then time at U.S. Strategic Command, then U.S. Cyber Command, and now I've been in the Pentagon about 6 or 7 months, working with Mike Chase over here as part of DI's element. I'm the Defense Intelligence Officer for East Asia, so really covering all East Asian intelligence issues for the senior leadership at the Pentagon. So during that period when I started working in China in the early 90s through where we're at today, the Chinese have really executed one of the most amazing kind of transformations of a military that we've seen, because it's not just in one area, it's really across every domain that you'd like to look at militarily. Space and counter space, they've gone from, say, if you were in 2000, they'd have maybe one ISR satellite in orbit at a time. Now you're hundreds of ISR satellites in orbit. And the same is really true, right down the line. air, naval, space, rocketry. They've really become a world or near world-class capability in all those areas. So I'd like to kind of trace the relationship between the US military and the Chinese military for just a bit, because it's a closely interlinked relationship over all those years, and talk about sort of what the PLA capabilities are today. So if you go back to 1989 with Tiananmen Square, so prior to that, the US had a really relatively close military relationship. We were selling Black Hawk helicopters. We had something called the Peace Pearl program, where the United States contractors with the US military was working to put F-16 class avionics into a Chinese fighter, the J-8 at the time. So all of those basically went on ice in the wake of Tiananmen Square. That went on, probably the next big important milestone was right after that in 1990 with the first Gulf War. And the PLA studied extensively US actions in the Gulf War and how we performed. I think they're, in their own hindsight, rather surprised at how quickly and effectively we were able to take out the Iraqi military at the time. So with the studies there, they went and really applied that to what you would do against the United States as kind of the world-class, undisputed military in the world, and really focused their attention on being able to counter kind of the core capabilities of US military power. And they really like to think about things in what they call a system versus systems approach. So if you take the F-22, for example, the idea is not to take their J-20, which is sort of similar to an F-22, and fight those one-on-one. The idea is that the F-22 has this entire system around it. It's everything from the basing to the fuel to the AWACSs that allow it to operate, to all the comms, to the bomb nav radars, and you basically go against each of these things individually. So you create capabilities to attack the bases, you create long-range weapon systems to go against tankers and AWACSs, you create jammers to go against all the various RF things associated with F-22. And so instead of having hundreds of sorties, you hope that you bring that down to having just a handful of sorties, and then you can handle that. And that's kind of indicative of the way they look at trying to deal with any problems like aircraft carriers or any other capability that the United States might bring to bear. So they really thought about that a lot, really through the whole period of the 90s. They did a bunch of internal reforms. The PLA at that point was very heavily involved in a lot of private companies, a lot of corruption, not a lot of time actually being in the military. So they purged themselves of that. And then you get to 1999, it was a pretty seminal year. US NATO involvement in Kosovo, without what the Chinese were viewing as a UN mandate. So their takeaway was that the United States was becoming a much more interventionist power at the time. We had the unfortunate bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which they took as a very direct and pointed affront. And then you've got in Taiwan, the political environment with Lee Teng-hui, who was the president at the time, floating ideas of two-state theories, which is really moving towards that path towards independence. So taking all of these things kind of in summation, in that time frame, they really started to put a lot of focus on not just sort of doctrinal and organizational modernization, but really putting a lot of money where their mouth was in terms of funding military modernization at the time. And so starting circa 2000, you really see a huge uptick in the military capabilities that they've either bought from suppliers like the Russians or, more importantly, developed and built themselves. So that sort of goes on. And the whole intent on that is really you've got to be able to develop viable military options for the Taiwan situation. Not that you're necessarily putting a date on a wall and saying, you know, in this date we're going to try to execute something. But unless you've got some sort of viable military options, you can't have that sort of coercive, hand-in-hand diplomatic effort to try to bring Taiwan back into the fold. And then the other thing is they always have to be aware that the United States is likely to be involved in military conflict over Taiwan, so you've got to have the capabilities to really offset the US military at the times. I'll point to a couple other kind of key things. 2016, pretty important, major reorganization of the PLA as a force, and most importantly, I think, is the creation of something called the Strategic Support Force, where they've brought together ISR, space and counterspace, electronic warfare, cyber, all into one organization really aimed at the heart of achieving the dominance in the whole information sphere, better using information themselves and denying the adversary use of information. And to them, this is like the heart and the soul of where they see warfighting going. And their success or lack of success is all going to be, I think, based on the success or lack of success for the Strategic Support Force. And then I think probably the last thing that's probably worth noting is what you've probably all seen in the presses this year is the modernization of their strategic nuclear forces, where they've gone from really a fairly small, purely retaliatory capability to now building out a force which, you know, could put them eventually in the ballpark of where the U.S. and the Russians are in terms of scale and scope of military or of nuclear forces. So with that, I think I'm going to call an end to my discussion. Thanks, Babe.
Thanks so much. Lara, I'm going to turn to you to give us the view from the Hill in terms of legislative solutions. Can you give us a little update on the Strategic Competition Act and any other solutions that you might see right now?
Can everyone hear me? Okay, I think so. Yes, of course, thank you so much. Great to be here with you all. So just by way of background, you all may have seen earlier in the year that the Senate put together a pretty significant China-focused package that brought together the work of 5 or 6 different committees, including the Foreign Relations Committee. I work for the ranking member, Senator Jim Risch, and so we worked with the chairman, Bob Menendez, on that. So we think, my boss thinks it was a pretty significant milestone, said that at the time, and that, you know, we were able to come together and put this together. I think the path forward, speaking really about the foreign policy focused piece, because as I said, there are many different pieces from the Banking Committee, the Finance Committee, and others. But speaking for the foreign policy piece, I do think there is a little bit of uncertainty going forward. And the reason for that is subsequent to the Senate process, which was very bipartisan and got us to the final product. The House process was not that way. The legislative product that's come out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is a partisan product, to be perfectly blunt about it, with very little input from the minority throughout the process. And the product also substantively is pretty far away. I mean, the gap, I think, between the SFRC product, which is really premised on the idea that China is a strategic competitor, is, as Dazzy Chase said, the only competitor that is capable of challenging the international system that we know today. I think that that premise even is far less present in the House version. And there's a lot in terms on the defense side, on the econ side, that we put forward in our bill that simply is not there in theirs. Their bill is also, you know, in terms of authorizations, this is very rough, but 2/3 pretty much on climate and 1/3 on everything else. And a lot of the climate-focused initiatives are not as China-specific. So I guess that's all to say that, you know, I think going forward, there's 100 different ways up the legislative mountain. You know, I'm not saying that it's not possible to come together on something, but we certainly, in our conversations, have made clear that we don't want to do something, or we don't want to accept anything just to say that we did something. Obviously, it's really important that the Hill come together on the challenge like China. It's critical, and it would be unfortunate if we were not able to do so, you know, in the coming months. But I think it would be less advantageous for the United States if we come up with something that does not accurately reflect the many challenges that we face, not just on the military side that's been discussed extensively, but also on the economic, diplomatic, and technological side. So I'm happy to discuss that further. I also just wanted to quickly say a few priorities that Senator Risch in our office thinks are really important that I hope will be helpful to our conversation. The one I want to mention at the top is Taiwan, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and the implications of increased PRC aggression and coercion there, and what that means for the United States and frankly for the whole region, because I think Taiwan's strategic significance in the Indo-Pacific really cannot be understated. Second is political influence in the United States. During the China process that I mentioned earlier, Senator Risch's top priority was a provision to expand the authority of CFIUS to review certain foreign gifts and contracts that dealt with intellectual property or technology, or that would provide a form of direct control over university activities, and he is going to continue to pursue that. The third that I'll mention is biosecurity and the efficacy of the Biological Weapons Convention. I think COVID has shed a lot of light on some of the risky research that's going on in China. It's really brought to the fore concerns that were already pre-existing about China's pursuit of dual-use research, which is outlined in the compliance report that the State Department provides to the Hill every year. That really poses some pretty massive oversight questions for Congress on how we are ensuring that we are not that the life sciences cooperation that we're pursuing is not being misused, and making sure that organizations with national security responsibilities like the Department of State, like the Department of Defense are also working with Health and Human Services and others who are responsible for public health and related topics. Fourth, I'll just mention, I think, is kind of what we could call the next phase of PRC economic statecraft, and by that I particularly mean their incorporation of extraterritoriality into their laws and regulations, which we're seeing not just in the Hong Kong national security law, but also in their export control law, in their blocking statute, where they will put pressure on foreign companies who seek to comply with sanctions laws or other laws that they view as unjust. And so I think, to the extent that we still have the time, and I think we do, I think we need to get ahead of that problem. And then finally, I will mention, we're always looking for opportunities across the board for collaboration also between the legislative branch and our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. And so I'll leave it there because I think I'm probably over time, but that's the other area of focus for us. So look forward to the discussion, and thank you again.
Thanks so much, Lara. So Robert, I know you've spent a lot of time living in China, studying Chinese leadership and the grassroots, and I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a perspective from that side of things. What's behind the Chinese strategy, and as it pertains to the U.S., and how do they see us?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. Very nice to meet with you. I'd like to talk both about Chinese leadership views, but also say a few words about the grassroots in China. I think that when we look at Chinese leadership today, what we're struck with initially is the confidence, both real and seeming, from Xi Jinping and his colleagues in Zhongnanhai. There seems to be a strong consensus within the Chinese leadership, but also within Chinese elites and ordinary Chinese, that the United States is in long-term decline. This is one of the premises of a lot of the foreign policy activity of Beijing. The notion that we are at least in relative decline and possibly in absolute decline as well. China sees itself, and this is an explicit part of its foreign policy discourse, as in the midst of a period of strategic opportunity. While they are very cognizant of American power, and they count our capabilities assiduously, they also feel that time is on their side. They like the trend lines, whether it is in the military realm regionally or in the economic realm or most other indices of power. There is a sense, and this goes way back, it predates Xi Jinping. There's been a lot of writing in the West about how this sense that a China-centric Asia is the natural order of things. We've had a lot of writing about that. And I think that we do see, under Xi Jinping, but also his predecessors, a very strong belief that a China-centric Eastern Hemisphere at least, we can discuss what their ambitions are beyond that, that a China-centric regional order is natural, inevitable, and desirable. Natural means that China is not to be blamed for seeking preeminence. This is the natural order of things. Inevitable means resistance is futile. And desirable, Beijing sees it as a self-evident good that a Chinese hegemony in the region would be a beneficial one for other countries in the region. And this is where he's had a tremendous amount of blowback in recent years. China has a big legitimacy problem, even among its regional neighbors, most of whom have China as their major trading partner and who benefit from economic relations with China, are very averse to increased Chinese political or geostrategic influence. And the evidence is that they very much prefer the United States as an offshore balancer in the region to prevent China from being able to do all that they would like. The Chinese answer to this, and the Chinese answer to the accusations that America has been launching against it, especially under the current and the past president, is that all China seeks is the welfare of the Chinese people. And indeed, you can make a case that China is simply doing what any large, ancient, proud, continental-sized, wealthy power would do, which is to shape the external environment to be more amenable to its needs and its desires in order to benefit its own people. And that's, up to this point, certainly true, that China's reaching for at least hemispheric preeminence is really no surprise. The issue is the specific threat that Dr. Chase has mentioned that China's aspirations pose not only to the United States itself, but to the rules-based international order. China's answer to that is that the rules-based international order is not exactly what we pretend it is when we throw that phrase around. In particular, the rules-based international order in the Chinese view, and not only in the Chinese view, is in fact not adequate or complete to all of the world's needs. It is not uncontested. It's always been contested. It is also evolving, and it is manipulable. And they have seen it manipulated and flaunted, especially by the United States, and they think that it's probably their turn to be in that position. So again, a confident Xi Jinping. Question about whether that confidence is wholly justified. As I say, global public opinion has been sharply negative. Even as we bled soft power over the past 4 years, China was not able to step in and take advantage of that. And the reason is that, I think to put it very simply, is that most of the people in the world don't want to live as the Chinese people live. We see this deepening now. I think we see domestic policies from Xi Jinping that are going to deepen distrust. He is not just cracking down on the wealthy, on fintech companies, on large corporations. He is actually carrying out now a sweeping attempt to change Chinese culture, behavior, and social norms. He wants new people. It's a cultural rectification campaign that is going to be sustained, and he's getting quite a bit of resistance from the grassroots in China. And when I say this, I don't mean to suggest that China is ripe for revolution. I don't mean to suggest, as Secretary of State Pompeo did, that there are divisions between the Chinese people and the government that we can deliberately exploit to tear China apart. I don't think we have the ability to do that, nor do I think the divisions are that strong. But a quick list of the kinds of restrictions that he is getting. From women, a large Me Too movement in China, fighting back in the courts, to some degree on the streets and on the internet, against sexual harassment and the patriarchy generally. We see female rock stars and female comedians also attacking the way that Chinese society has changed, even as it has developed. And this is, the government has to respond to this in some form. There is a long recent tradition of social activism for a better environment within China, clean up the air, the water, the land, which is to some degree legitimate and to which the government must respond. The young people of China, despite government exhortations, are marrying late and having fewer children. They are not going along with the program. The young folks who had been driving China's technological explosion are fighting back against the rat race, what's called the 996 culture, and they don't want to work 80-hour weeks, and recently Xi Jinping has put in laws to support them in that. We see the elderly fighting back against suggestions that they have delayed retirement. Gig workers want better working conditions, and netizens are pushing back against certain aspects of the surveillance state. So again, I don't mean China is ripe for a revolution. What I do want to suggest to this group is that our intelligence and our assessments of China need to look at the ongoing social churn and the deep fissures and the fragilities and the constraints in Chinese society. We need to look there for opportunities and clues as to where China is going, in addition to looking at their military capabilities. We're all very aware at the way that social division and cultural disagreement in the United States limits our own capabilities. It's not true to the same extent in China, because it is an authoritarian nation moving toward techno-totalitarianism. But it's still 1/5 of humankind. And these social factors are an important limit and check on some of the government's ambitions, and that needs to be a part of our analysis. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you. So we've gotten some great questions from the audience already. I'm going to start by posing one, a combination of one from the audience and my own. So since many of you are from the private sector, in the interim national security strategy, it says, we'll ensure that U.S. companies do not sacrifice American values in doing business in China, and will stand up for democracy, human rights, and human dignity, including in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. So what do we see from our different perspectives on how the Biden administration can work with or set new guidelines for American companies? And how can the U.S. realistically influence Chinese political and human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong? So whoever wants to start.
Do you want to start?
Sure.
Would you like me to start?
Sure.
Okay. So I'll start by saying that, if there's one China-related issue where Congress is in lockstep all the time, pretty much, it's human rights. And that, really does predate, it really goes back decades. We have people on both sides of the aisle who've been championing these issues in China for decades on the Hill members. And so that is certainly not going to go away. I think Congress is going to continue to really engage with and frankly push on the business community. The Olympics is driving a lot of that right now. There's a lot of engagement going on around how we handle an Olympics that's taking place in a country that the U.S. government has determined is committing genocide. So everything from public and private pressure to, working on things like forced labor and looking at supply chain dependencies generally, and also, access of PRC companies to U.S. financial markets and the broader economy, U.S. PRC companies rather that are complicit in providing material support to human rights. But I do think that, any systemic change in this area in terms of how the American polity as a whole deals with human rights and the implications for our economic engagement, we can only do, I think, so much in the Congress. We have a lot of tools, but I think systemic change has to come from industry itself. It has to come from the public being aware of these issues and really taking them on board in the types of decisions that we make. I think, the bare minimum is we're really seeing China pressuring us on our own soil. I was just reading about a case yesterday where in order for a high school in Colorado to participate in a UN committee that China is a member of, China asked that they change a reference to Taiwan in a news article that they published years ago and said they had to refer to Taiwan as a Chinese province. And they made that change. Now, I'm not trying to pick on a high school, but
This is a model UN thing, right?
yeah, right. It really shows that, nothing is, in some cases, nothing is too small for them. And we really need to take that on board. And at the very least, we cannot let the Chinese government pressure us on our own soil. And there's been much bigger examples of that. And so I think I really, our office really is always willing to engage with the business community on China-related issues. And in all the conversations I have, I just hope that there is some movement in different industries, among trade associations and others, to kind of band together, because I know standing out all by yourself can be difficult for one particular company. But I think we really need to see that. I think that's part of the mind shift that needs to occur to really to really understand that the United States isn't a long-term competition. It is going to require sacrifice. It is going to require change and tough choices. And if the only people are saying that are the people that live in this area of the country, I think we will be worse off. So again, I'll just leave with we are always willing to engage on those issues and talk to the business community. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. Robert, I think you...
Yes, I agree with everything Lara said, but we face a true, profound policy dilemma in this area. America is as powerful as it is in part because we have a lot of the world's greatest companies. They can't remain the world's greatest companies unless they sell into the world's greatest market, but insofar as they sell into that market, comply with its rules, and strengthen that society, they are now seen as perhaps undermining our power. So what do we do with that? And so we're faced really in the way that Lara just outlined it with a huge question of costs. We're talking about a competition with China, but what is it going to cost us? Not just in terms of military acquisitions, but especially in the business area. Under the Trump administration, when the Chinese, again, on our soil or in cyberspace, asked American airlines, American hotels to change their drop-down menus to reflect China's version of how Taiwan should be described. The Trump administration said correctly that this is Orwellian. But our companies caved because China puts money in their pockets, not the NSC. So I don't think we faced up honestly to the costs here and the fact that this is a profound dilemma. Secretary of State Pompeo, when speaking to Silicon Valley companies, said, vis-a-vis China, be patriotic and profitable. Well, this is non-guidance. How are you supposed to do that? No one has answered that yet. I don't know, where the Biden administration is on that question, but it's a true dilemma.
I'd just like to add briefly that whether we're covering the economic issues or the human rights issues that were part of that question, I think these are additional examples of where it's really important for the U.S. to work closely with its allies and partners. When we're able to do that successfully, I think we stand a better chance of influencing the PRC's behavior on these issues. When they're able to if they're going to be able to try to sort of divide us or diminish our ability to work together, they'll be in a better position. So I think this is a good example of where having bipartisan support on the Hill is important. Being able to contend with these issues in alignment with our allies and partners is really important here as well.
Good. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of get into the conversation a little bit, really, and talk cybersecurity for just a moment, because that's just a tremendous threat posed by, and it's not just the Chinese, it's also the Russians, obviously, but the way they've gone against clear defense contractors over the years. We've had more than a decade now of known exploits against clear defense contractors, to OPM databases, to just almost anything you want to look at. You've got a very hostile cybersecurity environment that the Chinese are behind, and they're pulling this data. They're using it for. It's way too simple to say, hey, they're building knockoffs of U.S. weapon systems, because that's not really what's happening here. But they are looking at U.S. weapon systems, and they're saying, okay, what are the vulnerabilities and the things that we can exploit in U.S. weapon systems? And then they're building weapon systems or capabilities to go against the things that they find out about the U.S. weapon vulnerabilities. Likewise, it's becoming a much more, their use of AI, smart cities, both internally for control. They're also exporting this technology, the ubiquitous use of surveillance, and then machine learning and AI associated with that. They're also applying those same technologies against U.S. citizens, U.S. military members, U.S. government members. It's a very, I don't think we have good answers to it at the moment. I noticed looking at the program, you've got some great folks here. You got Chris Inglis, you've got General Nakasone come to talk about these issues. They can both speak considerable length on all of these issues, and I'd encourage everybody to kind of pay attention to what they're going to say. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Bay. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Just on the same topic, I didn't want to leave it just yet. Michael, can I just ask, from the Biden administration's perspective, again, how can the U.S. actually realistically influence, Chinese human rights abuses in these areas that we care about?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll say that's probably a good question for State Department and White House counterparts to address at greater length than me coming from DOD. But I mean, I'll say that generally, I think, I mean, again, I'll just underscore the more we can do in alignment with our allies and partners, I think the harder it is for the PRC to sort of portray U.S. criticism in this area as somehow aimed at containment or at geopolitical advantage or something like that. And to be able to demonstrate that indeed there are things that are happening that are really concerning, not just to the United States, but to our allies and partners as well, because it's not about those kinds of things that sometimes I think the PRC suggests that we're trying to somehow use this as a card to undermine them or what have you, but that we have genuine concerns about the the repression that's going on. And again, I think that when that's shared by our allies and partners, and we're able to all talk about that publicly and privately as well, that it sort of puts us in a better position to demonstrate that these really are shared concerns by countries that have kind of shared democratic values and are have to speak out about what they see going on, and that it again is not limited solely to the U.S. raising these issues, but they're ones that are of concern to our allies and partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific and around the world as well.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that by saying, I think it is reliant on the business community as well. I mean, when you look at what happened in Australia, the business community had to, they came together. They chose to come together, take some losses, and actually push back on some of the Chinese sanctions that were being put on their products, which were set for, exactly for the Australian government speaking out about human rights abuses. So I think that is important to take into account. I'm going to go to the next question, which is about the region. So Southeast Asian countries are feeling pressure to choose between the U.S. and China. How can Washington mitigate Beijing's influence, and what will the region's foreign policy likely look like in 5 to 10 years? Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I mean, I think it is it's true that countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere don't want to be in a position where they feel like they have to choose that they're going to only have a good relationship with either the U.S. or China, right? I think that for many of those countries, they want to have stable, constructive ties with the PRC, even if they're also looking to to deepen their cooperation with the United States, right? So. But I think what we would say to them is that we're not asking them to choose the U.S. And to not be able to, manage their relationships with China in the way that they think is consistent with their own interests, but rather that what we're, kind of looking at here is more of a, kind of a contest, competition between different visions for the regional order and for the global system. So as Robert Daley said, I think it's pretty clear at this point that the Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party leadership really want China to be in the preeminent position in the Indo-Pacific, that they see that as a regional security and economic order that they want to reshape to their advantage, and one in which they'll be able to kind of rewrite the rules so that they're advantageous to the PRC, right? And then I think globally we see certainly some desire on their part too to kind of weaken aspects of the system that they find constrain them, to reshape others in ways that they think would be more beneficial to their own interests, and in ways that don't align with the shared values that we have and the kind of interests of of the U.S. and our allies and partners. So I think we look at it as to the degree that there's a choice. It's a choice between sort of a PRC dominated system and one that's more free and open, right? But that's that's not to to say that that those countries can't balance their relationships in the way that they want to try to do that. We're looking to cooperate more closely with with allies and partners, including in Southeast Asia. And I think to look out to the future. I'm hopeful that we can have a, kind of a deepened, sort of network there that also our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region can deepen their cooperation with each other as well. And I think that that's kind of the best way to kind of preserve a free and open order out there in the face of the pressure that China is putting on it right now.
Yeah.
Agree with everything Dr. Chase said, but I think there's a gap in it, which is the economic piece. This is an area that is largely about economics. It's growing very fast. It's very dynamic, and we really scored a huge own goal when we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then, of course, we're not in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as well. And some very strong, tangible move to recommit economically, I think, is necessary for the United States to have the credibility that it needs. I think it's true that allies are a big part of the answer to all of these questions. I think that this administration is to be congratulated for the enormous amount of work it has done and is doing to rebuild those alliances. But I'm worried that there's a piece of it that we haven't come to yet, and that is that if we cannot really strengthen our alliances unless we put forward a new positive narrative about globalization. And the Biden administration seems to have accepted the Trump administration's critique of globalization as sort of the playground of coastal elites that works against middle America. But if we're going to be working with allies, that is globalization. And many allies that we're asking to come on board with us more closely, sometimes in opposition to China, we know that China takes names and that China will impose a disproportionate economic cost on them. It did it with South Korea. It's doing it now with Australia. And they will continue to do that. So what does that mean? It means that if we're going to allies and asking them to take risks on behalf of the global rules-based order, or however we frame it, and they know that China is going to impose a strong economic cost on them, they are going to ask for increased access to the American market. That's going to be the cost of really having the allies on board. And that's probably something that we need to be willing to do, and that means, I think, prepping by having a new globalization narrative that says this is positive and works in America's interest. I think we're going to run into a conceptual problem here if we don't do that. Agreeing, though, Michael, with everything that you said.
And I would just add, I agree that having deep economic relationships with those countries, which we do,
Right.
but looking to make sure that there's a U.S. economic leadership, regionally is apparent to them as well. I think that's an important component of this, and some efforts to kind of develop greater resilience and ability to kind of resist some of the coercive economic measures that China has employed. I think is also an important sort of component of this equation.
Great, thanks. Anyone else?
I'll just add that, I think Southeast Asia is a huge opportunity. And I hope it's one, I don't know all the different sectors that are represented here today, but I hope it's one that the business community is looking at, because we do need the private, this is also, we can do a lot in the public sector, but this is also, where the private sector comes into play in a huge way. I did serve in the Trump administration prior to going to the Senate and worked on the economic aspects of that administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, and really the top priority was integrating private sector collaboration into everything that we did. Or maybe a better way of saying it is making sure that that was first. And I think, on the Hill, we're really looking at, what are some of the big opportunities that we see in East Asia on the economic side, and certainly what do we need to do to seize those opportunities, but how can we shape our foreign assistance and our other tools to also help Southeast Asian countries to become more attractive markets for us as well. One example I'll just point to quickly is Indonesia, which has taken a big step forward with a big package of reforms that it just pushed through its legislature very recently. But there's still a long way to go on issues like corruption and domestic requirements and procurement reform, things that are not very not much talked about, but are really important. And so again, coming from a Hill office where we work directly for you, we talk to companies and others all the time about issues that they face in these markets, and their ideas for how we can improve that and how U.S. government economic tools can be brought to bear, and that is the remit of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee specifically. So, just also want to say again that we're happy to engage on those issues directly.
Thanks so much. Another question. What options does the U.S. have to prevent a forceful reunification of Taiwan? And does the U.S. have the political will to get into an armed conflict with the PRC over Taiwan? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I'll start on that. I mean, I'll say, first of all, kind of building on some of Wayne's comments earlier, I think Xi Jinping has made pretty clear that he views the national rejuvenation of China by 2049 as kind of linked to their goal of unification or reunification with Taiwan. And I think we're seeing since President Tsai's election in 2016, just a kind of increasing PRC pressure and coercion against Taiwan across all the different elements of power that they've got to bring to bear there. So attempting to isolate Taiwan diplomatically, some economic pressure on Taiwan, sort of information operations, and then military activity, including now, basically sort of very frequent air activity, around Taiwan that I think many of you are probably familiar with. And so that concerns us, and I think Taiwan is an area where having strong, principled, bipartisan support is very important. Our policy is still a one China policy with our longstanding commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances. And so, I think what the challenge that we face here, of course, is that the PLA's capabilities are growing, as Wayne Ullman described. And I think we've got, with the Taiwan Relations Act now, sort of 40 plus years of, very strong, commitment to meeting Taiwan's defense needs. That again enjoys bipartisan support and has, across administrations. From the PRC's perspective, as Wayne Ullman said, I think that they, basically have to assume that the U.S. is going to support Taiwan. The kind of pivotal events that Wayne sort of outlined from the 1990s, the Gulf War, had a lot to do with kind of PRC and PLA perceptions of the technological challenges and organizational challenges that they face. 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, I think, judging by some of their military writings and what we've seen in terms of how they've modernized their forces since then, I think went a long way to convincing them that they had to be prepared on the PRC side to contend with third-party intervention, U.S. intervention in the event of a conflict with Taiwan. And then the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in May 1999, as Wayne mentioned, I think also was really kind of an important inflection point in PRC thinking about the kinds of defense capabilities and capabilities for strategic deterrence that they wanted, right? So. But for us, keeping up with the pacing challenge here means that we have to be constantly also enhancing our own concepts and capabilities and investing our resources in the right way to make sure that we'll be able to continue to contend with that effectively. I mean, again, I won't get into any kind of specific engagements or activities with Taiwan, but just to highlight that our support for our defense relationship with Taiwan is always going to be aligned against the threat that the PRC presents, and again, is still very much guided by the Taiwan Relations Act as it has been over the last 40 plus years now.
Yeah, and let me jump in on some of that. Xi Jinping's made it quite clear that he views the eventual reunification with Taiwan as kind of critical, likely a legacy issue for him. He has all likelihood he'll have an additional term that'll start next fall, I believe. So there's still a few years, but I think in many ways the view from Beijing sees this as a lot of unfavorable trends. They've got their own demographic issues that they're dealing with. There's regularly economic clouds on their own horizon here that they're going to have to deal with. And if you look at the political dynamics within Taiwan, the DPP has been now in power and pretty significantly in power. The KMT is a minority party, and I think unlike earlier DPPs where you were really flirting with independence as a declared issue, I think now it's more independence curious, but they still lean in that direction here. And I think even within the old KMT, there's much less kind of desire to try to come to some sort of agreement that would result in some sort of reunification in some sense. So all that being said, the Chinese have a bunch of trends that they're trying to that make things more problematic, I think, as we get through the 2020s here. And so the United States, we have an opportunity here, I think, with the withdrawal finally from Afghanistan, to put much more focus on China and the Taiwan issue too, and military capabilities to support that. And it's all about deterrence. You've got to make sure that the Chinese every day wake up and believe that they're not capable of being able to deal with United States involvement under a Taiwan conflict. Meanwhile, again, for the view from Beijing on this, right, they've got two goals in mind. One of them is looking at Taiwan is to continually convince the Taiwan leadership that the PRC has the military capabilities to force a reunification if needed, and then also to really sow tremendous doubt in their mind that the United States is going to come over the hill like the White Knight and save them. And then the view as they look at DC is much more, it's like, this is not the fight you want to get involved with. We've got, the PRCs presenting a wide array of military capabilities, all untested since '79, but still, to basically sow doubt in the United States to get to the sort of thing that Bay, you were sort of referring to, where the United States may not be willing to exert the national will, I think, to come in and support Taiwan. So, that's not the situation today. That's not the situation we should get into. So we just need to kind of move forward with that in mind. Over.
I'll add to that just by starting with repeating what I said earlier, which is, Taiwan is its significance is beyond itself. It is significant for the entire region and our strategy and our posture there. And I think we really have to keep that in mind as we go forward. I agree with everything that's been said, and I also agree with the framing of the question as one of political will. The entire defense and political military title of the Strategic Competition Act is framed entirely around the need for political will in the Indo-Pacific on this question, but also for our, in terms of strengthening our alliances and partnerships in general. I think concretely, where we are right now, we need to resource our defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific. We need to grow the defense budget in real terms. We should not cut it. We need to resource the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. That's obviously the Hill's job. It's Armed Services drives that, so I won't get too much into the details. I think we need to make sure that we're fully aware of what's going on there, and that political leaders across the board, executive and legislative branch, understand what kind of decisions we'll have to make depending on what comes to pass. We need to continue upholding our commitments under TRA with regard to defense articles to Taiwan and doing so in a timely manner. And we need to press Taiwan to implement its overall defense concept and pursue the defense reform that's needed to protect itself. So those are all the things I think that are actively, being discussed on the Hill, because there is a recognition that this is a question that we need to be focused on more so than we did before, and we need to the mind needs to be focused. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. Robert, did you want the last word?
Just
or-
one last sentence. We also need to resource diplomacy, including public diplomacy in the region. That presence is extremely important, and our information programs are also a key part of our presence in the region. So I would just say, diplomacy also needs to be there. It's not just a military question.
So let me just jump in again, I'm sorry, but the one thing you made me think of is the Chinese concept of public opinion warfare. So that's something that they've got, again, a major investment in, and very focused, again, on just the things I was talking about. Eroding will in Taiwan, eroding will in the United States. They've taken a lot of lessons, of course, in what they've seen the Russians do over the past number of years. So I think that whole idea of seizing and dominating the information narratives and the information space, I think, is going to be critically important as we go forward here. Over.
Which is, I'm going to take the last word, which is why it's so important to increase funding for congressionally mandated broadcasting networks such as Radio Free Asia. So thank you so much for coming. We're out of time. There were some great questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but thank you so much.